Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think I
I
played with
talked
some
those.
stuff on your Zoom.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Zoom, the boxes that used to be on the screen, it's gone, right?
Yeah, because I integrated the Microsoft Office 365 with Zoom.
So I basically talked to the people, the Zoom people, and they had
Okay,
me.
I won't get the credit. Yallah.
There you go, Noura. Sorry, I just had to, yeah, I had to spill the beans. I actually stayed with them and even removed the auto record thing that was getting on my nerves. So
Oh,
yeah.
good. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. No more boxes. Alhamdulillah.
No more boxes, alhamdulillah. Okay, here we go, my friends. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So here we are. Noura, you will always get the credit, Noura. You know, no, Allah yabarik, Allah yazik al-khair, Allah yabarik fik. I could never reward you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you. قال عيسى ابن مريم اللهم ربنا أنزل علينا مائدة من السماء تكون لنا عيدا لأولنا وآخرنا وآية منك وارزقنا وأنت خير الرازقين. So yesterday and the day before, or at least the days before, we pretty much surrounded around the whole idea of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't give us all the details and all the details about Surah Al-Ma'idah or about different stories like Ashab al-Kahf or other stories. And we also were going into the theme of these surahs or these stories at least, and what the theme is really telling us is that العلم اليقين حق اليقين and عين اليقين. So we were going within that field and explaining that عين اليقين and علم اليقين and how that basically increases, decreases, what we need to do to train, and how that relates to our iman, how that relates to our life, how that relates to our vision. And this is extremely important. How it relates to our vision, we're not talking about the physical vision, meaning our eyes, but we're speaking about the insight and the potentials that make us and give us the capacity and the capability to see the world in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to see the world in. So we're speaking about not seeing matter in motion, but seeing that the different matters that we're putting it in basically a mission. Okay, so it's yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us the different things in matter. Yes, there is a potential, there is a certain motion that He gave us the free will to use in order to make sure that it's channeled towards a mission, and that is basically the definition of al-khilafa. So we talked in details in regard to that, and we were also talking about civilization. We talked about civilization, and we said that Islam differs, and that's where Ibn Khaldun had mentioned that there's a difference between civilization and al-Madaniyya or al-Hadara. Talked about, Ibn Khaldun says that there's a difference between talking about modernity or talking about the different things that you probably could invest in, whether it's in governance or probably making streets or probably making architecture or probably making those different things in. And certainly we're speaking about in Islam that the main drive to creating such modernity or to creating a civilization, the drive is Tawheed. The drive is La ilaha illallah, and basically the mission is to invest in the akhirah, to invest towards the akhirah. You know, yesterday, it's quite interesting. I was reading about the history and the philosophy of civilization and history of all of that, and was talking about how all civilizations, or at least most of the civilizations, they basically started in areas where there are rivers, Mesopotamia, the Nile River, or the Euphrates and the Tigris and the Euphrates, or even in the Indus and in the northern part of India. And it was talking about water and how that was the main place of what happened to civilization, and talked about how the interpretation of civilization and what really makes a civilization differs from the Western concept, which was really focusing on modernity, and how the Muslim civilization was focused on building the inside of human beings, the inside of what makes the motivation channel towards al-akhirah. But here's one thing. If you actually look at most of the civilizations, if we're looking at the pharaohs, we're looking at the Babylon, we're looking at in Mesopotamia, we're looking at the Greek, we're looking at even the Indian civilization. You look at most of the remains of those civilizations, they were really religious temples. They were religious temples that remained. Certainly there were some streets, certainly there were some things, but then you look at, for example, the pharaohs, the drive was definitely religious to make the pyramids. And the pyramids, all their investment to make the pyramids was because they believed in a hereafter, or at least believed in whether it's reincarnation or whether it's believing that they're going to be going towards some kind of a life, and therefore they needed to invest in that life. And that's what they were investing. Same thing if you were to look at the Babylonians and the Sumerians, and the list goes on, and looking at what they were trying to do. It was really a force, or their main drive was actually shirk. It was pagan. It was shirk that drove them towards building all those civilizations. So it just occurred to me, subhanAllah, maybe that's one reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had still regarded it as jahiliyyah. So certainly we could see that they were having a driving force towards I guess understanding how mathematics, geometry, physics, and chemistry, and all those different things worked in order to make such a civilization, which we only would see the remains of it. We would only see the remains of probably temples, maybe buildings, etc. And we could see that the remains, or even other civilizations, and usually the remains are worship sites. And subhanAllah, when you're seeing the worship sites actually founded on shirk, on deviation, even if we're talking about Pompeii, we're speaking about a deviation where it was literally a sex city, and what remains is really those remains to tell us what kind of practices they were doing. And it was just a couple seconds, and I think it was 36 seconds or so, where this volcano erupted and then turned this place into nothing but stone. Now, are they Qawm Lut? Most likely not, but in the end, just for us to learn that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about a civilization, that it is to be centered around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that even if a certain group of people managed to make temples and managed to make streets and probably use their knowledge in science, physics, geometry, mathematics, and probably even astronomy, etc., that if the driving force is not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not faith, or at least the faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and tawheed, that it's basically an effort wasted. An effort wasted to basically go towards something that is not going to bring them success, and certainly not going to bring them that contribution to making a better life, not in this dunya and not in the akhirah. So they had invested. You look at the amount of effort, you look at the amount of labor, the amount of effort that was basically put in making these pyramids. It's definitely, there's no doubt that it was great effort, and great to meaning huge effort to make this happen, in whether the size or even the planning or the amount of mind and mental force to basically even calculate each and every single thing to make sure that this architecture stays strong and formidable for all the different types of changes in environment. Definitely, they used their math. They definitely were very smart, very intelligent to make this possible. We're not just talking about the pharaohs. You're talking about the Aztecs. You're talking about you're talking about India as well. We're talking about the Huang He in China as well. I hope I said the name right. That civilization as well. They were using all their study and all those different calculations to understand, well, how can we make this place a better place? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was also telling us that these civilizations, the main move was not necessarily to make only their lives better, but they were actually gearing that towards a certain driving force, that it was towards another life, because they understood death. They knew that death was inevitable. But how are we going to make of death, rather than something that is fearful, make it of something that we basically don't fear? So we work towards and put the effort towards that. But that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was calling it still a jahiliyyah, because they channeled their matter and their motion, or slash their efforts, towards the wrong mission. Okay, if you steer your matter, you steal your forces, you steal your efforts towards the wrong mission, that's a jahiliyyah on the spot. And certainly when, of course, you compare that even with today's modernity, although it's called a civilization, they would, well, Arnold Toynbee basically considered that it's a civilization because, hey, you've got technology, you've got math, you've got, those sophisticated studies to basically stand out there. Therefore, it's a civilization. But Islam considered that no, you're this shallow interpretation of what makes a civilization, Islam considers that's too shallow in your definition, because it's not enough to build sophisticated things that surround you, because are we going to describe perhaps a lot of what the animals would probably do within their kingdoms? Maybe, hey, a world of ants, a world of perhaps different animals that we may know of and may not know of, but they definitely create certain things. But is it necessarily supposed to be in a building, or how do we break that down? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, well, guess what? Even animals, وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا أمم أمثالكم. Whether we're speaking about animals that walk on earth, or whether we're speaking about probably a fish creating some kind of design right in the middle of the sea, and this design is very, very intricate in the fine details of what would basically make it seem that it's to reflect that fish and its ability to maintain the house and maintain the place. And we're speaking about birds making very different, and every single bird is using a different type of I guess a study or an instinct in order to build their own nest. How do we understand all of that? So what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, it's not enough to create certain certain, whether architecture or understanding how things function. Certainly, as human beings, we definitely know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had elevated man above animals by giving them intellect. But if you had the intellect, it's not enough to understand how things function, but it's really important to understand where you're channeling this effort, this potential, whether we're speaking about mental potentials or whether we're speaking about physical or whether we're speaking about learning how to subjugate and use these matters that surround you in a way to bring about ease in life, to bring about basically the channel towards akhirah. So, okay, let's get to, that was just a summary. Let's get to our piece. And this piece that we are going to be doing, there are going to be a couple different pieces than what we've been discussing the past few days, but I thought it would still, we're going to get to, well, why did I think this was even important? We're going to get to the theme of it. Okay, so we said that scholars had differences of opinions on whether the supper or the last meal or the supper, whether it's the last supper or whether it's a meal, whether it was sent down. And we said that that wasn't necessarily the big issue because definitely the ayah or the verse can contain rather some ambiguity. So we're not really capable of being really definitive whether it was sent down or not. But we said that is not the main theme here. The main theme is not whether it was sent down or not, because it doesn't really make a difference. Any difference on us, it doesn't make a difference on us. Even if it was sent, well, they had seen it, we hadn't seen anything. So it really doesn't make a difference on us. What makes a difference on us is basically the theme, understanding that if you basically got to haqq al-yaqeen and you got to ayn al-yaqeen, going back to your level and going into this regression is basically going to be, let's say the implication is going to be bigger on the person that had reached a certain level, whether we're speaking about haqq al-yaqeen or certain ilm, etc. So we were talking about that emphasis that they were disciples, now they were getting prepared to be apostles, to being teachers, etc. You were reaching haqq al-yaqeen, so therefore there's no regression. If you were to regress in your faith, then the implication is going to be not only on yourself, but even on those that surround you. And it's quite interesting. There is a story that mentions that, I want to write that for you. That's quite interesting. I absolutely love the story. So what does the story say? That Abu Hanifa, we don't have necessarily the evidence or at least the record that this is an authentic story. It was mentioned, okay? So let me write that down for you. So Abu Hanifa sees a young boy, and this young boy, Abu Hanifa tells him, إِيَّاكَ أَن تَسْقُطْ. Be careful, you don't want to fall. So then the child responds and he said, بَلْ إِيَّاكَ أَن تَسْقُطْ. As a matter of fact, you're the one that should be really careful from falling. Why? Because سقوط العالم سقوط العالم. Because the fall of a scholar is the fall of a world. So if you were سقوط العالم سقوط العالم, when a scholar basically goes into a regression, a collapse, or probably gives the wrong fatwa, that implication is going to be on the world. It's going to be on all the people. سقوط العالم, it's going to be basically a regression for all humanity. Okay, so I guess I just had to share the story, even though we don't really have any evidence. It was qila. Okay, just a story that was mentioned. Okay, let's continue right there. So like I said, whether the food was sent down or not, like we said, it's not necessarily the issue, but in the end, just learning the lesson. فَمَن يَكْفُرُ بَعْدُ مِنْكُمْ. In the end, of course, فَمَن يَكْفُرُ بَعْدُ مِنْكُمْ. Here we go. فإني أعذبه عذابا لا أعذبه أحدا من العالمين. Can we necessarily use this and say قياس and make an analogy and say, well, just like he told the disciples of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, if I would send down the meal, therefore that would basically mean if you regress in your faith, then you're going to be punished, a punishment that no one in all over, well, basically humanity or anyone would be punished into a punishment similar to it. Can we necessarily use that as an analogy and tell, let's say we've got a scholar in fiqh or we have a scholar in hadith or whatever, and let's say they committed the sin and we're going to tell them, guess what? Your punishment is going to be even worse, and basically use that analogy? Well, the answer is no, but this would be something that we would take as something that is to inspire us and not necessarily use it as an evidence. Okay, so we would just get this inspiration, mustawha. It's like an inspiration where we could see that certain stories are sending us these messages, these signals, in order for us to understand, whether we're speaking about the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, whether we're speaking about the scholars, whether we're speaking about probably somebody that, hey, you memorize the Quran, it is not befit for you to engage in such a behavior. You were taught, for example, Islamic studies. You went to an Islamic school, you know better. Or you probably are raised by parents that had taught Islamic studies. You should know better. You should have been at least getting a better inspiration, and you should have seen it. In other words, you should have made that inspiration bring in the light into your heart, a change into your behavior. So let that be something that inspires you. And of course, certainly when you do find that, I mean, it's something that you would hope that every single person, live up to the expectations of not necessarily others' expectations, but up to your own expectation. I would always tell my children, if you want others to honor you, you have to honor yourself. You honor yourself. You bring that honor to yourself by letting others know that you appreciate your potentials, that you appreciate the principles, that you appreciate all the mannerisms, and therefore you would appreciate that others would respect you in the same way. And this is part of how we would have to raise our children. But in the end, it's something that you could get the inspiration from the Quran, but not necessarily use it as an evidence. Okay, but an inspiration, just that is that wahi, or at least the wahi or the inspiration of it. Remember the word wahi? We said that it had 4 different meanings. Okay, now I want to go into something rather interesting. Let's just look at this one. The stories that were mentioned. I'll read the stories, and then I want you to wait until we get to the theme, okay? Wait, let's see. Ibn Abbas had said that Isa ibn Maryam had told Bani Israel, the children of Israel, you have to fast 30 days and then ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala whatever you would want. So they would have to fast for 30 days. So they fasted for 30 days, and then they said, oh, Isa, if anyone had done what we had done, they would have actually given us if we were to fast and we were to get hungry and فَادْعُوا اللَّهَ أَنْ يُنَزِّلَ عَلَيْنَا مَائِدَةً مِنَ السَّمَاءِ. In other words, we did our homework, quote unquote. We fasted, we got hungry. In other words, we deprived ourselves from food, from water, etc. So now, in other words, we did our homework. Now we want you to make the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send a meal from the heavens. So the angels came in with basically a good amount of food. They were carrying it, and on it there were 7 different loaves and 7 different fish, and they put it between their hands. In other words, it was put right in front of them, and basically فأكل منها آخر الناس كما أكل أولهم basically. So all of them, whether we're talking about the first and the last, in other words, everybody was full. Okay, everyone was full, and the first and the last, everybody basically got a complete and a full meal. Let's see right there. You could see أخرجه الطبري. You could see it was mentioned in the Tabari, Ibn Abi Hatim, and even الثعلبي في عرائس المجالس. And those are the resources that you will find the same story basically mentioned on and on. Let's see another story. ذكر أبو عبد الله بن علي الترمذي الحكيم. Now, when you look at الترمذي, there are more than one Tirmidhi, okay? There's Abu Isa الترمذي, which basically whenever we would see a hadith, usually it says رواه الترمذي, okay, in his Jami' or in his Sunan, okay? Or at least it's known as a Sunan because it's a Jami', but anyhow, okay, so that's Abu Isa الترمذي. This Tirmidhi is a different Tirmidhi, okay? And what did he say? Well, he basically narrated a story in his book, Nawadir al-Usul. When you say Nawadir al-Usul, we're speaking about stories that are basically mentioned as rare stories, and usul, basically not necessarily fundamentals per se, because it could mean principles. Anyhow, so he mentions this story. Let's look at this story. So he does definitely have a whole chain of narration, but just by having a chain of narration doesn't make it authentic. Let's see what he says. So he says, when this basically Salman al-Farisi that he had narrated, when I had asked, well, not him, but Salman al-Farisi قال لما سألت الحواريون عيسى بن مريم صلوات الله وسلامه عليه المائدة قام فوضع ثياب الصوف ولبس ثياب المسوح وهو سربال من مسوح أسود ولحاف أسود فقام فألزق القدم بالقدم وألصق العقب بالعقب والإبهام بالإبهام ووضع يده اليمنى على يده اليسرى ثم طأطأ رأسه خاشعا لله. What is the story? So he said, when the disciples, الحواريين, they basically asked Prophet Isa عليه السلام, peace and blessings be upon him. So basically for the meal, he basically put on some wool garment, and he also wore the garment of al-musuh. So it was kind of like a specific garment that was to show kind of like a cloak. Okay, and it was a kind of a black cloak, and he put it on himself. Then he let the foot next to the foot and the heel next to the heel, and his fingers. If you want to look at his hand, okay, so we're talking about the thumb right with the thumb and the left hand on the top of the right hand, then lowered his head and then made the dua and started making the dua while crying to the point that the tears would flow on his beard. And it was flowing to the point that it was going on his chest, and then he made the dua, Allahumma rabbana anzal alayna ma'idatan min as-sama'. Oh Lord Almighty, let a meal from the heavens come down, that it would be a holy day for the beginning and the last of us, and make it a miracle from you, and give us from your provisions, for you are the best for the providers. So the Lord Almighty said, Inni munazziluha alaykum, or Inni munazziluha alaykum. I am sending it down to you. So a meal that was red in a circle thing in 2 clouds, and it was covered basically with some covering and within these 2 clouds, and everyone was looking at it. Isa alayhi salam said, Ya Allah, let this be a mercy and not something as a trial. And O Lord Almighty, I ask you with the miraculous things and you would give me. So right there between the hands of Jesus, peace be upon him, comes like a handkerchief or like a covering on it, and it was covered basically, and Isa alayhi salam basically prostrated, and along with him the disciples, and they could smell the beautiful smell of basically the aroma of what they had never smelled like before. So Isa alayhi salam then said, who's the best one in worship and the most brave one on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and let them be the one to uncover so we can eat from it. And we would mention the name of Allah and we would thank Allah Almighty. So then the disciples, they basically said, oh, Spirit of God, you are the one that basically has the priority over us to do that. So Isa alayhi salam basically made that ablution wudu and the best of the wudu, and then basically prayed a new prayer, made a new invocation in a long invocation, then sat down and uncovered the meal, and there was on it a fish that was grilled fish. There's no thorns and no bones in it. And it was basically having all the different, I guess, it was basically soft and juicy, basically, and all the different types of lentils and all the different types of, I guess, the good things of food are all around it. And there was even salt and vinegar as well, and on its tail there, or near its tail, there were 5 different loaves of bread, and each one had 5 different pomegranates, and on the other side there were also dates, and on the other side as well, olives. Okay, let's see.
Are we invited to this?
I know,
just
I'm
kidding.
invited to this. Exactly. Let's see. If Thalabi had mentioned rather also another similar story. He said each and every single one basically had olives. On the other side, there was honey, and there were some eggs, and on the other side, cheese and some beef jerky or some kind of like a dry jerky. And then, of course, the Jews, they basically had heard of all of this, so they came in to just see it, and then they were really astonished to see all of this. Simon, who was basically the head of the disciples, he said, "O Spirit of Allah, is this part of the food of dunya, or is this part of Jannah's food?" Isa alayhi salam responded, are you still going to increase in your questions? I fear that you will be punished for all of this. So then Simon says, well, no, it's basically the God of the children of Israel. I didn't want to say of any harm. So then they said, that is the disciples, "Oh, Spirit of God, if there was another miracle with this." So Isa alayhi salam basically said, "Oh, fish, become alive by the order of the Lord Almighty." That's when the fish basically starts shaking and its eyes opened, and the disciples feared of seeing this. So Isa alayhi salam, he said, "Why am I seeing you asking of more and more? And every time you would get something, you would hide it. I would just fear that you would be punished for this." And of course, that's when it basically, and he said basically, لقد نزلت من السماء وما عليها طعام من الدنيا ولا من طعام الجنة ولكنه شيء تدعو الله بالقدرة البالغة فقال لها كوني فكانت. Basically said, well, now you got a meal from basically from the heavens, and it wasn't from the food of dunya, and not from the food, in other words, this life, and not from the food of Jannah, but it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had innovated now with his mighty ability, and he told it to be, and it is. So that's when Isa alayhi salam said, "Oh fish, go back to what you were in, the state that you were in." So then the grilled fish basically became that fish that when alive now became a grilled fish back again. So that's when the disciples said, "Oh, Spirit of God, you be the first to eat it. And then he said, I seek refuge in Allah. The only ones that are going to eat from this are really the ones that asked for it. That's when the disciples, they were afraid to eat from it because they were afraid that it was going to be a trial and a test. So when Isa alayhi salam saw this, that's when he called on to the poor people and the needy and the sick and the lame ones and the ones that basically had different skin diseases, and the ones that basically were paralyzed and the blind and all the different people, basically the people, Ahlul Ma'il Asfar. So we're talking about, I guess in that area, we're speaking about a certain race that was known to be at that time, a blonde race, I guess. All right. And he said, Kulu min rizqi rabbikum. And he said, eat from the provisions of your Lord Almighty and from the invocation of your prophet, and thank the Lord Almighty. يكون المهنأ لكم والعذاب على غيركم. You would get the joy of eating, but then the punishment would be on someone else. So that's when they basically ate, and 7,300 people, they basically were burping of eating, and every single person that was ill that ate from the meal basically got cured, and every single poor person basically became rich for the rest of their life, and they would eat from it until death. And when all the people had basically went into, I guess, ازدحموا عليه. So it was like a rush. Everyone was rushing to it, and not a young, not an old, not very old, and not basically a youth, or even a rich person or a poor person was left. They all came to eat from it. Okay. And when Isa alayhi salam basically saw this, so they were giving it kind of like a rotation, and it was coming, well, being sent down a day, and another day it wasn't sent down. And for 40 days, it was basically getting sent down. I want you to look at this one. Of course, this is just an idea of some of the stories, but this one's really rather interesting, that basically they had refused, that is the disciples, to eat from it, or at least some of them, and then some people were basically fighting to eat from it. But then those that ate from it, they had 33 people that basically were cursed into pigs, and these ones that were cursed into pigs, they basically started eating basically the garbage that was around and all of that. And then Isa alayhi salam, when these pigs, they came, they basically kneeled down on their knees, and that's when Isa alayhi salam basically saw that they were crying. So Isa alayhi salam just said, aren't you X and Y and Z? And they just nodded with their head that yes, that's who we are, but they couldn't talk. Okay, so you could see these stories, but I want you to look at this one. That is القرطبي. He said, في هذا الحديث مقال ولا يصح من قبل إسناده. In other words, we don't actually have an authentic narration to prove that this basically is authentic. So you could see all these stories right there, and I want you to look at this one. And he was saying, well, Ibn Abbas, they basically said that on that meal there was bread, there was fish, or whatever it had on it. But then let's see. And Wahb ibn Munabbih basically said there was barley, there was fish, etc. But do we actually have any evidence on that? We're going to get to that point, okay? I just want you to just say you will find some stories in the books of Tafseer, but that doesn't make it authentic, okay? So yes, can I, I'll tell you a funny story. My grandfather, Allah yarhamu.
Allah yarhamu.
Allah yarhamu. A really off topic, He was like, hey, I heard you got something called Masters in Sharia, whatever that means. That's what I was at. I only had a master's at the time. And I said, yeah. And he was like, whatever that means, but let me tell you something. I'll always know more than you. I said, yes, my dear grandfather. And he said, I just want you to know, I'm a very good reader. and I can know everything, and you still have a lot to learn. I said, that is true, my dear grandfather. And then he said, well, let me ask you a question because I really want to test your ilm. I said, fair enough. Go ahead. What's your question? And he said, you know Ashab al-Kahf, you know the story, right? I said, yeah, I heard of the story. I'm still learning. What about the story? And he said, if you had done enough research, can you tell me the name of the dog that Ashab al-Kahf had? And I said, that's not even an issue for me to know. And he said, you see, you did not learn the basics of talab al-ilm. I said, the basics of talab al-ilm. Okay, what is the basic of talab al-ilm? And he said, you should have said, وَمِنْكُمْ نَسْتَفِيدُ. And I'm going to get the benefit from you. I'm going to tell you what the dog's name was. And I said, what was it? And he said, it was called Wa'il. And
Oh yeah, that story was funny.
exactly. He's like, what? You know, the last thing I would really want to know is what the dog's name was. It's
Has he ever done?
what was that? No, yeah, you know, yeah, it's just it's not even a theme. I mean, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Kahf that even their number, he kept it ambiguous because it's not this
Issue.
it's not an issue.
No.
It's not an issue. What
No,
the
no.
dog's name
It's
was.
not relevant. We
It's
don't need to know it.
Exactly. What kind of a dog was it? A German Shepherd, a Dalmatian? That's not an issue.
Yeah, we
It's
can, from this story, we can get some gems about the like what pay attention for when Jesus, peace be upon him, asked God the way. I guess maybe the Christian, they asked God, they put the thumb over the thumb and the right over the left, as if like
so, you know, here's the thing, like you were saying, you know, when we look at these stories, and I purposely wanted to mention these stories because I wanted you to see that just by having details, it doesn't make it authentic.
yeah,
Okay?
yeah. But
That's what I wanted to get to. You know, you might say, well, you spent a lot of time just reading these details. I wanted to show you and express that these details would be basically meaningless if there's no
yeah.
evidence to support it. That's what matters. Okay?
What concerned me is that the way they like the Christian ask Allah, they don't open their both hands, same like the Muslim. This is what I focus on.
You
That
know,
we are
here's
the
the
only
thing.
ummah that we ask Allah in this way.
So
Sunnah.
we don't really know that. I mean, we don't really know whether Prophet Isa alayhi salam did in the way that narration described,
see
with
the
the thumb on the
Christian
thumb and etc. Well,
in
here's
the
a
church.
question. Did the person that narrate the story, the whole story, we don't really have any basis for it. Did they make up the story to make it seem that it contained a basis? So it basically, hey, they saw how the Christians were worshiping, and they basically got, okay, here's the inspiration from that. And that's not necessarily an evidence to prove that even Prophet Isa alayhi salam was worshiping this way. Okay, let's look at this hadith. Oh, maybe this one will give us something better. Okay, let's see. خرج الترمذي في أبواب التفسير. الترمذي basically mentioned in the different basically chapters in tafsir. So what does that mean? الترمذي, even though it's usually famous as Sunan al-Tirmidhi, but it's actually not Sunan. Wait a minute. So what does that even mean? So the scholars of hadith, their main focus, most of the scholars on hadith, were actually focused on a hadith that related to action. And that's why they were called sunan. They were called sunan because they were related to action. So usually the sunan would start with Kitab al-Tahara. It would then go to Kitab al-Salah, the chapter of Salah, the chapter of Zakah, the chapter of Siyam, etc. Okay, so that's basically that classification. الجوامع would basically contain on all chapters. It would start كتاب بدء الوحي, for example, just like al-Bukhari would start with talking about the stories of how al-Wahi started. It would start with the كتاب النيات or إنما الأعمال بالنيات, and it would continue speaking about perhaps other stories, and maybe it would talk about even maybe food, maybe it would talk about manaqib, it would talk about the different descriptions of salihin, etc., different descriptions of sahaba, etc., all those different things. You would not find that in the Sunnah. That's why Sunan al-Tirmidhi is actually not Sunan al-Tirmidhi, it was actually al-Jami' al-Tirmidhi. Anyhow, so you would see abwab al-tafsir not in the Sunan, but you would find it in maybe Jawama right there. Okay, what was the story? Get to the point. That Ammar ibn Yasir had said that the Prophet ﷺ had said, now this is a quote, that now this one's the Prophet ﷺ, أنزلت المائدة من السماء خبزا ولحما وأمروا ألا يخونوا ولا يدخروا لغد فخانوا وادخروا ورفعوا لغد فموسخوا قردة وخنازير. Okay, now the story is of the Prophet ﷺ, that the supper was basically sent down and there was bread and meat in it. What kind of meat? Is it fish? Is it, it's some kind of meat, okay? And they were ordered not to betray. And they were ordered not to keep anything for the following day, but then they betrayed, they kept some for the following day, and that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had cursed them into monkeys and pigs. Let's say Abu Isa, now this is the other Tirmidhi, okay, the original Tirmidhi, let's call him that way. Okay, he basically said, well, this hadith, he said, is basically mawquf ولا نعرفه مرفوعا. Wait a minute, I thought he said قال رسول الله. Basically said, well, this hadith is basically narrated off Ammar ibn Yasir and not necessarily off the Prophet ﷺ. Therefore, you could say he said وَلَمْ يَرْفَعُ, and it's not necessarily off the Prophet ﷺ, even though it said قال Rasulullah, but then you could see Tirmidhi is basically saying, well, we don't actually have an evidence that that's what the Prophet ﷺ had quoted, but we have stronger evidence that that was Ammar ibn Yasir. He could have probably learned it from somewhere. Maybe he heard it from Christians. Maybe he got some information out there and not necessarily information from the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, وَهَذَا أَصَحُّ مِنْ حَدِيثِ الْحَسَنِ بْنِ قَصْعَةَ وَلَا نَعْلَمُ الْحَدِيثِ الْمَرْفُوعِ أَصْلًا. Yes. And he said, we don't actually know an authentic narration of the Prophet ﷺ or tracing back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. And the most important thing, you could see they're going to mention other stories and other quotes, what was actually on the meal and all of that. And let's see, he said, قُلْت, that is al-Qurtubi. All these different three narrations is basically opposing the hadith that was narrated in At-Tirmidhi, and it would basically be more authentic. And despite all of that, it was not authentic in tracing back all to the Prophet ﷺ, but it traces back all the way to Ammar ibn Yasir. And he said, وَالْمَقْطُوعُ بِهِ, listen to this one. This is the most important quote. This is the thing. He said, what we know and what we could be definitive of and assure of is that it was sent down, أَنَّهَا نَزَلَتْ, and there was something for them to eat. What was on it? He said, Allahu a'lamu bita'yinihi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what was actually in it. What was in it? What was the meal? Allahu a'lamu bita'yinihi. There's no definitive answer to basically know what really happened. So I'm going to dismiss a lot of this. You could see there are more stories that we're mentioning, but I just want you to get to the theme is this one. Allahu a'lamu bita'yineh. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. Just because there are some stories doesn't necessarily make it right. And even when al-Qurtubi mentioned these stories, it doesn't mean that he approves them. And that's why many times people would go to the tafsir and they would basically take this information and they would skip, for example, this most important quote right there. You see all those pages that we skipped? This is the most important quote. You see it? It's just one small quote, but that's the most important quote. He said, Allahu a'lam bitayinihi wal maqtu' annaha nazal. What we know of is that it was sent out. What was on it? All these stories. He's like, we don't really have any evidence that traces back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, and this is part of ilm al-ghaib, making all those stories really, yes, I'll mention it to you just to let you know that I know, and just to let you know that, yes, here's the stories that were mentioned, but it doesn't mean I agree with it. It's just to let you know that this was scrutinized. We don't have an evidence to prove that this is authentic. Just wanted to mention that one. It's not that I know, I'm just basically lisanu hal al-Qurtubi. Okay, let's see. Here's another issue. Actually, I wanted to talk about one very important figure, and that is this guy, Abu Abdullah al-Tirmidhi al-Hakim. Because we were talking about two Tirmidhis. We talked about a Tirmidhi. Let me see, am I supposed to be talking about it? Yeah, right there. So we talked about a Tirmidhi that basically collected Sunan al-Tirmidhi, but there was another person, and that is Abu Abdullah al-Tirmidhi. And so what happened? So Abu Abdullah al-Tirmidhi, he was, I would say, inspired by Sufism, and he was actually known to being al-Hakim. He was known as the wise Tirmidhi. And he went in details in talking about how the Prophet ﷺ was basically eating and what kind of meals, and how the Prophet ﷺ was living, at least in every single corner in his life. And those are some of the books that he had basically written. Nawadir al-Usul, and let's say Adab al-Nafs. You could see it's all about, when you say Nawadir al-Usul, he's basically focused on speaking about those sunan that people usually skip. Adab al-Nafs, talking about the different adab that you're supposed to be maintaining and basically preserving. Al-Manhiyat, as-Salah wa maqasidha. You could see that his focus was mainly on Sufism. Let's just see some of those quotes. I was going over some of his quotes, and it was really rather interesting as some of the things that he had said. And I really, really needed to share some of the different things that he had said. Let's say, so this is basically Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, and we're quoting from that. And he said, Al-Imam al-Hafiz. And note, on this page, you could see we could actually do an English translation. See, look at it. Gave you the whole English translation of what we're going to be reading. But you know me, I don't go for the English translation. I like to go directly to the butter. Okay, let's say. And he said, Al-Imam al-Hafiz al-Arif al-Zahid Abu Abdullah. He said he's basically al-Imam, the great scholar, and he called him az-Zahid, the ascetic, the one that basically gives up on dunya in order to connect with an akhirah. But, you know, while I was reading some of the different things, regardless of who his shuyukh are and all of that, he said, وَلَهُ حِكَمٌ وَمَوَاعِظٌ and لَوْلَا هَفْوَةٌ بَدَتْ مِنْ. Let's see. He said he had a lot of wise words and basically beautiful preaching and different orations that he was saying, except one mistake, and he called it a hafwa. Hafwa is like a trip on something. He tripped on something that wasn't basically something that that was befitting the ilm and the beautiful faith that he had. Let's see some of those things that he has. كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ عَيْبًا أَنْ يَسُرَّهُ مَا يَضُرُّ. It's enough for a person to basically commit a sin, or at least it's a flaw that whatever is harming them that basically brings them joy. You know, they're probably maybe drinking and they're not realizing that they're harming their body, but then they're so proud and they're so happy and they're feeling entertained. This is my favorite quote. Let's see. من جهل أوصاف العبودية فهو بنعوت أوصاف ربانية أجهل. يا سلام. What does that mean? Whoever, look at this word. من جهل أوصاف العبودية. What is أوصاف العبودية? If you don't know the different paths of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there's no way that you can recognize the different descriptions of the Lord Almighty. You would become really ignorant. So what does that mean? If the person didn't know how to kneel down to their Lord Almighty, then they don't know what it means to be humble. If they don't know how to give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they don't know what it means to live in value. If they don't know, this is awsaf al-ubudiyya. In other words, if they don't know the different ways of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there's no way that they will be capable of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His magnificence. So if they don't give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they will never get to recognize the name Ar-Razzaq for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If
deep
they
meaning, Ya Rabbi.
deep meaning,
Very and
yeah,
الحكم that Ibn Ata is-Sakandari, it gives the same way, the same
exactly.
tone. Ya
You know,
Allah.
it's amazing. من جهل أوصاف العبودية. If you didn't actually take the time to blend with the different ways of ubudiyya, the different ways of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you're not going to be capable of seeing beyond the world around you. You're not going to be capable of knowing who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is.
Allahu
Let's
Akbar.
continue. Yeah, there you go. Let's look at this one. صلاح خمسة في خمسة. What is salah? Is salah meaning if you want to bring piety, there are 5 people and piety comes to them in 5 different ways. صلاح الصبي في المكتب. If you want to really bring about good piety and basically good mannerisms for a child, he needs to be in school. 2. صلاح الفتى في العلم. And for the basically for the youth, their salah, their piety, their, let's say, their success basically comes in seeking ilm. Salahul kahli fil masjid. And an elder person, if they really want to be on the path of salah, on the path of piety, then they should be in the masjid. Salahul mar'ati fil bayt. And for a woman, her place of piety, to increase her piety, is basically at home. Salahul mu'dhi fi sijn.
Allahu Akbar.
Want to salah
Right, right.
This is just interesting.
Allahu
And the
Akbar.
person that is harmful to people, you want to correct them, you got to put them in prison. وسئل عن الخلق فقال ضعف ظاهر ودعوى عريض عن الخلق سئل عن الخلق فقال ضعف ظاهر ودعوى عريضة. And he was asked about mannerisms and he said ضعف ظاهر. A person is probably not capable of recognizing their weakness, da'wa arida, but then they would claim that they know everything. They're boasting that they know everything, when in reality, this is basically right there. So when he was asked about al-khuluq, not al-khalq, but al-khuluq, all right, he said, you know, the worst of the mannerisms is basically a person boasting about some strength that they don't actually have. They're claiming to be rich when you could actually see they're
I hate that.
not capable of even paying their own bills. It's like, yeah, so you bought a car, in an expensive car, but then you're behind with your mortgage, you're behind with your bills, you're behind with putting your kids even in Islamic school. when you should have actually put your kids in Islamic school rather than getting a rich and an expensive car. This is ضعف ظاهر. We could see your weakness and then دعوة عريضة, and a big claim right there. Or somebody boasting that they have all the knowledge when you were to basically, corner them with certain questions. They wouldn't even be capable of answering any questions. Remember that professor in St. Thomas University was basically pretending like he knew the Islamic world and he was basically a scholar in Lugha Arabiya, but the first 2 minutes that I talked to him in Arabic, and he was like, I would rather speak in English because I forgot my Arabic. It's like, oh, now you say it.
So how you explain صلاح الصبي في المكتب? Which مكتب؟
المكتب المدرسة.
مدرسة.
في معرف
كتاب.
عندهم اسمها المكتب اللي هي عند الكتاتيب.
نعم.
At that time, they used to call it al-maktab, basically the school, basically the place to learn. So not al-maktab to mean the office. During our times, al-maktab means office. During that time, al-maktab means
الكتاب. And each of these hikmah of 5, it can remind us with one ayah from Quran, subhanallah. That al-hikmah, it comes after, these things, the 5 hikmah, صلاح الخمسة في خمس, each one can remind us with an ayah from the Quran, as if the hikmah comes after he understood the meaning of Quran.
Absolutely. When you're talking about, the child, there has to be a certain type of discipline. How are you going to put a child to get into a discipline? You're going to have to put them in that maktab, in that place to contain them, a place to discipline them. And certainly al-ilm comes in, and al-kahl, an older person, it's time that you would discipline yourself in the masjid. A woman, time to discipline her basically in
وقرن في بيوتكن.
And they'll tell you, right now there's the new Islamic or Muslim feminists. They're basically wanting to say, well, no, this is only a word and an ayah that is only directed at the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, etc. And it's really sad how they don't see that shaitan is giving them all such inspiration.
Right.
Wallahi, shaitan is giving them such inspiration. You want a good inspiration. You go to the Salihin to give you the right inspiration, and not taking it, not from Fatima al-Mirnisi and not from these feminists and etc. No, you go back to the Salihin, to those that basically got the inspiration from the Quran and Sunnah. Salah al-mar'a fil bayt.
Yeah, honestly, subhanallah, you can feel it. I mean, the more you're out of the house, the more you get stressed out.
Absolutely.
Subhanallah.
Absolutely. Taking that time. We talked about staying at home and all of that. Like, definitely, وَقَرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنْ. This is definitely an order for the Prophet ﷺ's wives, but it's also something that is basically to teach all the women. This going out frequently is going to put you in a fitna. It's going to put you in a fitna. So learn how to discipline yourself. You don't have to continuously expose yourself, or even expose yourself to the other things out there, or even expose yourself to others as well. Okay, let's continue right there.
صلاح المؤذي في السجن.
صلاح المؤذي في السجن.
ولكم في القصاص حياة يا أولي الألباب.
Absolutely.
Everything from Quran.
Absolutely. صلاح المؤذي في السجن. Sometimes, it's hard for me to. One time, not one time, well, actually a couple times, I had parents come to me and mothers come to me, and their children were doing the wrong thing, and she was wondering, what should I do? And I said, you know what? It's okay. Sometimes they need those prison time, and don't necessarily bail them out. It was so hard for many mothers to say, I'm not supposed to bail him out. And I would say, yes, it's okay. Don't bail them out. Let them understand that they need to stay for some time to review, that they need to correct. their behavior. They need to think about the choices that they're making. I know it's extremely hard.
Yeah, if we always bail out the kids, how are they going to learn themselves?
الله نورة الله يا ربي يستر علينا والله يحمي أولادنا وأولادك يا ربي. I know it's easier said than done. It's easier said than done. But sometimes as parents, and especially as mothers, sometimes we have to think with our mind and not think with our emotions. And Ya Allah, Allah ya Rabbi, يهدي أولادنا ويثبت أولادنا وأولادكم. Make dua for our kids. You know, you could do all the lecturing, you can do all the teaching, you can do all the Islamic schools, and you can put all that. والله الهداية من ربك. والله الهداية من ربك. لا بشطارتي ولا بشطارتك.
Just we ask him 17 times, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم.
اهدنا الصراط المستقيم.
We begging.
There you go. So, my friends, I'm gonna go
I'm
to
sorry, I
drop
got
off.
number 4. What's the 5th one, please?
Which one?
Woman at home, then the
المؤذي في السجن. The person that is harmful to people, the place of discipline for him is in prison.
okay.
Yeah, this book, Abu Abdullah Tirmidhi al-Hakim, this thing from this book.
I'm sorry.
No, those are Abu Abdullah Tirmidhi. He basically had all these different books. You could see Adab al-Nafs, you could see Al-Manhiyat.
What you read now, for which book?
Well, this was a quote that basically al-Dhahabi was quoting off of Abu Abdullah Tirmidhi.
We can open this page just to click.
Sure. That's really quick. Just basically go to, let's do it here. You're basically going to put Abu Abdullah Tirmidhi al-Hakim. And of course, you're not going to go to Wikipedia because that's not an authentic resource. But then you're going to go to Sir A'lam al-Nubala and basically right there in Islam Web, and you're going to find it.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Yep, وإياكم. So we're still not done about Abu Abdullah Tirmidhi, inshallah, but I have to drop my husband off at the Salat al-Jumu'ah. I know you're like, why can't he drive by himself? Because there would be no parking. There would literally no parking. People would park. This is real. You'll only find this in Malaysia.
Come on,
You know the street lanes? People use those as parking, ironically. There's no parking. So the street.
Allahumma.
I had never seen this. I mean, man, the police would love this and just basically just put parking tickets on those cars, but you'll only find this in Malaysia where I don't know if it's legal or not, but yeah. So I started doing the same thing because there was nowhere to park. So
If you can't beat them, join them.
I mean, Salah al-Mu'dhi في
Only
السجن,
with that
right?
issue.
Nura, Salah al-Mu'dhi في السجن, that's
أيوة.
it.
الله يزيد المسلمين يا رب. الله يزيد
Allah
المسلمين.
al-Musta'an. So I started doing the same thing. I'm like, okay, there you go. I guess this is the right parking. When I saw it, when I first saw it, it was like, yo,